In this Sikha, the Rebbe discusses a medrash on the words Vayetze Yakov mi Beersheva, Vayelech Harana. And the medrash on these words explains that in addition to the simple meaning that Yaakov leaves Be'er Sheva, we could also understand the word Sheva as the word Shvuah, which means a promise, which means an oath. Yaakov was trying to avoid having to make an oath to Avimelech. That is, Avrohom Avinu had made a treaty with Avimelech, made a promise to Avimelech. Yitzchok Avinu made a treaty with Avimelech. Yaakov Avinu does not want to make a treaty with Avimelech. What was the story? Why doesn't Yaakov want to make this treaty with Avimelech? Because the Medrash says that as a result of the promise that Avrohom Avinu made to Avimelech, Yidden were delayed coming into Eretz Yisrael for 7 generations. Avrohom Avinu said, you're not going to start up with me, I'm not going to start up with you, our children are not going to start up with each other. So 7 generations the Yidden weren't able to go into Eretz Yisrael. 7 generations goes from the time of Avrohom Avinu till Moshe Rabbeinu. As we know, Moshe Rabbeinu is the 7th from Avrohom Avinu. Yitzchak comes along and makes a shvuah again to Avimelech. Another generation is added. Now, not only doesn't Moshe Rabbeinu bring the Yidden into Eretz Yisrael, it's delayed further. Yeshua is going to bring the Yidden into Eretz Yisrael. Yaakov Avinu does not want that this should happen for another generation, so he leaves Be'er Sheva. He doesn't want to have to make this shavua to Avimelech, so that the Yidden shouldn't be delayed another generation. So the Rebbe asks, we need to understand from both sides. On the one hand, Avrohom Avinu and Yitzchak seemingly were not worried about making this promise. So why is Yaakov worried? On the other hand, if Yaakov is worried, why weren't Avrohom and Yitzchak worried? Why were they able to make this promise? In order to explain this, the Rebbe says we have to have a look at the general difference in the avodah of Avrohom and Yitzchak compared to the avodah of Yaakov, which is going to explain to us a major difference in their avodah. We all know that Avrohom Yotza Mimenu Yishmoel. Avrohom had a Yishmoel coming out of him. Yotza doesn't only mean coming out of him, Yishmoel, but it also means he left him. Yishmoel left the path of Avrohom Avinu. He left the avodah of Avrohom Avinu. He left that level of kedusha of Avrohom Avinu. Yitzchak had an Esav. Again, Yotza Mimenu Esav. Esav leaves the kind of lifestyle of Avrohom Avinu. They're not connected anymore to that kedusha. Yaakov, on the other hand, we know his darga is mitosei shleimo. All of his children are tzaddikim. All of them are perfect. All of them are connected to the level of Avrohom Avinu, to Yaakov Avinu. Now we know, of course, the Avos were all great tzaddikim. The Avos were a merkava telikus. They're neshamis of atzilus. Nevertheless, there's a difference in how they dealt with the world. While Avrohom and Yitzchak were involved in the world and even trying to elevate the world and so on and so forth, but nevertheless, it's specifically Yaakov that causes an absolute transformation in the world. In other words, Avrohom and Yitzchak, yes, they dealt with the world, but it was still shaykh to be a Yishmoel and an Esav coming out of them, because their general way of dealing with the world was mainly making sure that there's nothing blocking their avodah, nothing getting in the way of the avodah of Avrohom and Yitzchak. In other words, Avrohom is spreading a likus and making sure nothing could get in the way of that. Nothing is going to block Avrohom Avinu's avodah. In fact, the Rebbe explains, in the Ha'ara mainly, even though we know that Avrohom Avinu was makariv a lot of people to the Eibishter, and he made lots and lots of geirim, but ultimately we don't have anything from those people. None of them remain. The only one that remains from Avrohom Avinu is, of course, the Yidden. So the way Avrohom dealt with the world was mainly by negating the bad, but not a complete transformation of the bad. And the same thing is true regarding Yitzchak. Yitzchak was digging wells. We know that this represents elevating sparks from the lowest of the low. But again, it's mainly the avodah was causing that he should be able to do his own avodah without the world getting in the way. On the other hand, what's Yaakov's idea? Vayelech Harana. He goes into a place where there's the anger of Hashem, into a place of negativity. He is going to act in a positive way to transform the world into Kedusha. This is very similar to the difference between a tzaddik and a bal tshuva. A tzaddik is mainly about not having anything to do with the ra, with the evil at all. A bad thought can't even pop into his mind. On the other hand, what's a bal tshuva? A bal tshuva has the ra, he has the negativity, and he's transforming it into good. Says the Rebbe, since as far as Avrohom and Yitzchak are concerned, the ra was not completely negated yet, not completely nullified yet, not completely transformed yet. That means to say there's still some room for negativity, and this is expressed even in their own children of Yishmoel and Esav, that they still remained who they are, Yes, they're not. They even once they were elevated to a certain extent, they're not disturbing Avrohom and Yitzchok and their avodah. But it's not that they're complete. That the klipa is completely gone and not shaykh anymore to exist. In other words, as far as Avrohom and Yitzchok are concerned, there's still a possibility for klipa to be in the world, as long as it doesn't get in the way of kedusha. And this is exactly what happens as well when Avrohom is sitting amongst the bnei ches. Yes, they respect him. Yes, they give him the Ma'aras HaMachpelah, but we can't say they were transformed into Kedusha. Again, on the other hand, what about Yaakov Avinu? His inyan was transforming the Klipos into Kedusha, and that's why we say by him there's the idea of Mitas Shleim and his own family as well. Everyone's tzaddikim. Now we can also understand what the idea of the bris being made with Avimelech is. The bris is again that you shouldn't start up with me, I won't start up with you. What's the idea over here? In other words, that Klippa shouldn't get in the way of Kedusha. But we're not saying that Klippa can't exist anymore. We're not saying that Klippa was transformed into Kedusha. So as far as Avrohom and Yitzchak are concerned, there is still Klippa. We're making a bris with it. And it still exists in the world, as long as it's not getting in the way of Kedusha. However, as far as Yaakov is concerned, there's no room to make any sort of peace with Klippa. Klippa cannot exist. Klippa needs to be completely destroyed, or obviously, best case scenario, obviously completely transformed into Kedusha. Now we can understand when it says Vayetze Yakov Be'ershava Vayelech Harona, these two things follow from each other. Vayetze Yakov Be'ershava, that means he's no way he's going to make a promise and a treaty to the goyim and to the klipa. What's his next avodah? Vayelech Harona, just the opposite. He's going to get involved with places like Haran to transform it into Kedusha. Says the Rebbe, bring this back now to the idea that Avrohom and Yitzchak didn't have a problem with making the Shavuah to Avimelech, even though the Yidden were delayed because of this. Whereas Yaakov Avinu doesn't want to make that Shavuah, because it's not just technically about making the Shavuah itself. What we're saying is that in the times of Avrohom and Yitzchak, as far as they're concerned, there is still Klippa in the world. It wasn't possible to get rid of that Klippa completely yet. And therefore, as a result of that, it's also not time for the Yidden to go into Eretz Yisrael. It's only after Yaakov Avinu deals with the world, transforming the world, and not tolerating the Klippa at all, but rather anything of Klippa wherever possible to transform it completely. This is the way the Yidden could end up going into Eretz Yisrael. And the same thing that Rebbe says is true in regards to La'asid Lavai, that it's going to be again this kind of avodah of Yaakov that brings the Geula Hasidah, transforming the Golos, transforming the world into Kedusha. And as the Gemara actually says, that the Beis HaMikdash HaShlishi is going to be not like Avrohom Avinu, not like Yitzchak. By Avrohom it says the term Har regarding Har HaMiri, and by Yitzchak it says the term Sodeh, which both represent a certain temporary state to a certain degree. But La'asid Lavai is going to be dafke connected to the Geula of Yaakov, which called it Bayis, and that's going to be, of course, Bevias Mashiach Tzidkenu.